Hi everyone, so the focus of my paper is on the influence of religion in Millennium Hall. The question that I wanted to ask that helped to guide me in writing my paper is, did debates about morality during the 18th century help Scott to construct her novel? What I learned from doing my research for this paper is that these debates influenced quite a bit. What I uncovered is that three central themes seem to emerge around this conversation about not only morality but ethical living, which were reason, a term that comes up several times in Millennium Hall. Morality, as the term is central to the debate being had about how to live a life consistent with the teachings of God, and education, which allows people to become moral beings. It may be useful to begin briefly with some background to help with this essay in context. So, the crux of this debate is that women during this period were looking for ways to get individuals to live morally sound lives in the image of Christianity so that those who follow God's teachings could live in the service of others. To do this, people needed two things: religious education and a sense of reason that could guide people towards that education to properly serve others as God commands. By doing this, by allowing reason to properly guide one's education, people could become moral agents who served others. So, in relating this back to Scott's novel, I broke my essay down into three parts: a portion on reason, a portion on morality, and a portion on education, each of which being central to the overall debate about how people become moral agents who serve God by serving others, could be used to show how Scott, like female thinkers of the time, could lead her readers to act as selfless moral agents rather than take each component as being interrelated pieces, which they are in the context of the debate. I instead thought it would be easier to break each down and investigate them separately to show, on a more detailed and intricate level, how the themes of reason, morality, and education influenced Scott's novel to prove with greater certainty that these debates did in fact influence Millennium Hall. So I wanted to begin this investigation by looking at Deborah Weiss's essay, Sarah Scott's Attic School, More Philosophy, Ethical Agency, and Millennium Hall. And the essay essentially outlines Millennium Hall using both the novel's inset narratives, which have the stories of the women who live at Millennium Hall, and the descriptions of Millennium Hall, which comprise the other portions of the novel, are used in tandem to critique a form of philosophy known at the time as moral feeling philosophy, in which emotional action takes precedent over ethical action. So for Scott, emotional action, which calls for an individual to sympathize passively with the plight of another, was morally unacceptable, and instead, people should take a more involved role in the suffering of others, just as the women of Millennium Hall do through their philanthropy work. I then argued that reason for Scott, rather than emotion, was part of the solution, allowing individuals to connect with the plight of others in a more sensible and rational manner. For instance, I looked at the scene at the beginning of the novel in which Lamont and Mrs. Mansell are discussing the cage that keeps the former circus performers out of the gaze of curious eyes. Lamont is for the cage, seeing it as an example of man's superiority over others, while Mrs. Mansell sees Lamont's ideas as reminiscent of tyrannical thought. I argued that Lamont's ideas come from a place of ego and emotion, and so for Scott, are selfish and flawed. Mrs. Mansell's ideas, however, come from a place of compassion and rationality, and so are, for Scott, correct, because reason has allowed Miss Mansell to care for those people without letting emotion cloud her judgments. I then move on to the topic of morality, using solely E. Lavoria's essay Rethinking Female Chastity and Gentlewoman's Honor in 18th century England to do so. Her essay brings up an interesting point, which is that chastity during the 18th century could be performative, with women faking their sexual purity in order to maintain their sense of honor. I take this notion of performativity and apply it to Scott's novel by looking at Lady Mary's relationship with Lord Robert. While the term chastity is not used explicitly in Scott's novel, the terms virtue and morality are. These terms during this period both had sexual meanings of purity. The relationship between Lady Mary and Lord Robert is sexual in nature, with Lord Robert taking advantage of Lady Mary's fashionable looseness in an attempt to take her virginity. However, a friend of Lady Mary's intervenes, helping to place her in a position where she can become a virtuous woman who cares more about being moral than being fashionable. Here, the look of fashion is performative, with Lady Mary acting the part of the fashionable woman rather than the moral woman. Scott does not complete this transition for readers, but she does demonstrate, using Lady Mary as an example, that such a transition is in fact possible. I then end the paper with a focus on education by using Katie Halsey's essay, The Home Education of Girls in the 18th Century Novel, The Pernicious Effects of an Improper Education as a Guide. She notes in her essay that the novel was used to argue what constituted a proper education, with topics including how to inculcate moral principles and what the proper occupations for women would be, which are just some example of topics, incidentally, that were written about in conduct literature, because Millennium Hall can be seen in some ways as a conduct literature novel, just in its pedantic nature, I would say. And so I focus on this theme of education by looking at Lamont, a figure who throughout the novel demonstrates the most growth as he is the individual most in need of a proper Christian education. So while at the beginning of the novel, Lamont is resistant to the ideas favored by Scott and the women of Millennium Hall, like the idea of caring for others, as the episode between him and Miss Mansell related earlier shows, by the novel's end, he is a true convert, reading the Bible to show how devoutly his faith in both Christianity and the teachings of the women of Millennium Hall has become. So Lamont becomes the truest example, in Scott's terms, of a true convert, and so benefits most from his time at Millennium Hall. My conclusion at the end of my paper affirms the guiding question that I asked, which was, did debates about morality during the 18th century help influence Scott's writing of Millennium Hall? Clearly, the themes of reason, morality, and education that emerged from these debates could be seen in her novel, informing how she guided the novel's direction, be it to affirm the power of reason, as with Lamont or Mrs. Mansell, or to affirm the need for moral behavior, as shown in the relationship between Lord Robert and Lady Mary. At each turn, Scott offered the reader a guide by providing moral do's and don'ts, allowing the reader to be led along the path of moral and ethical living by using the novel's stories as an educational guidepost. So thanks for listening to my presentation about my essay. Hope it's informative and useful, and I look forward to hearing your comments and sharing my ideas with you as well.